Welcome to the Deep Dive, Your Majesty. Today we'll be taking a really efficient path to understanding the philosophy of A.J. Ayer.
Oh, absolutely. A very important figure in 20th century philosophy.
Yeah, and I think as a philosopher king, you'll appreciate this. So we're using these excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Carefully chosen, I assure you.
Yeah, it really gives us this concise overview of his work, like a really well-prepared briefing. All right, so Alfred Jules Ayer.
Lives from 1910 to 1989.
Right, so he's fairly modern. He was a leading voice in British intellectual life, and he was a big proponent of logical positivism.
Which came out of the Vienna Circle.
Exactly. So his most famous work, Language, Truth, and Logic, published in 1936. That's really a landmark text. And our mission today is to really extract the core, the essence of his thought.
The key ideas.
Yeah, and specifically those that I think will resonate with you as a philosopher king. So how do we understand knowledge, meaning, and the limits of human understanding, those kinds of things?
Absolutely. And we'll be looking at a range of his views, his ideas on the nature of philosophy itself, what it means for something to be meaningful and true.
Right, perception.
The problem of induction, and of course how he defines knowledge and analyzes things like necessity, causality, even freedom and ethics.
So a lot to cover. And it's important to remember that Ayer was really in this tradition of British empiricism.
Following Locke, Hume, and Russell.
Yeah, he was all about really analyzing the meaning of the fundamental concepts we use, to build our understanding of the world. All right, well, let's start with how Ayer saw the role of philosophy itself.
Well, for him, philosophy wasn't about establishing some set of first principles.
Or being a defender of science, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Instead, he thought its primary role was to critically analyze the language we use, both in science and in everyday life.
Interesting. So the statements we make, those are the focus, not the actual, metaphysical reality behind them.
Well, he would say that the metaphysical reality isn't really the concern of philosophy. Philosophical propositions are about the language we use.
I see. So it's more about clarifying the logic of what we say, not so much about discovering ultimate truths about the universe.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay. So what was a good example of this kind of philosophical analysis for Ayer?
He often pointed to Bertrand Russell's theory of descriptions. Imagine the statement, "The present king of France is wise."
But France doesn't have a king right now.
Right, but the sentence itself seems to imply that there is one. Russell showed how you could rephrase these kinds of sentences to reveal their underlying logical structure, and that helps to clear up the confusion.
So instead of assuming there must be a king of France, we analyze the statement itself to figure out what it's really saying.
Precisely. And Ayer saw philosophy as doing this kind of work more broadly, uncovering hidden logical structures in our language and resolving these philosophical puzzles through careful linguistic analysis. In fact, early on, he even called philosophy a department of logic.
So it's almost like a kind of conceptual cleanup crew, making sure our language is clear and consistent so we don't get tripped up by these logical pitfalls.
That's a good analogy, and I think that emphasis on the careful use of language, avoiding these unnecessary problems, would resonate with any leader, especially one concerned with clear communication and effective governance.
Right, making sure everyone understands the orders clearly. But, it's interesting because despite focusing on this logic of science, Ayer himself didn't have that much deep training in either formal logic or the sciences.
Yeah, that's true. And while he ended Language, Truth, and Logic with this grand vision of philosophy becoming the logic of science, the book itself isn't actually that heavy on symbolic logic, which you see in other logical positivists like Carnap.
So his focus on logic was more about the general idea of clear thinking and analysis, rather than getting bogged down in the technical details of formal systems.
I think that's right, although he later did acknowledge this gap in his scientific training. And he always maintained that to effectively analyze science, philosophers really needed to understand science, maybe even become scientists themselves.
Which makes sense. But it seems his real interest was in epistemology, the nature and scope of knowledge.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's move on to one of his most famous and probably controversial ideas, his rejection of metaphysics.
Oh, yes. That's a key part of logical positivism. And Ayer was pretty adamant about it. He didn't just think metaphysical statements were uncertain or vague. He thought they were, literally meaningless.
Meaningless. So not just wrong, but, nonsensical.
Exactly. He thought they came from, errors in language or grammar, or from trying to apply our emotions to things that can't really be described that way.
So if someone came to you, Your Majesty, and claimed they had knowledge of some ultimate reality beyond our senses, beyond observation, Ayer would say that's meaningless.
He'd say it can't be verified through any kind of experience, even in principle, and therefore it just doesn't have any real meaning. Not that it's false, but that it doesn't even make sense in a philosophical context.
Hmm. So a king who claims to rule by divine right, for example, Ayer would say that's just empty words because there's no way to verify that claim.
You've got it.
Okay, but I read that Ayer's view on metaphysics actually softened a bit over time.
That's right. He was influenced by the pragmatist thinkers like Peirce and Ramsay. He came to see metaphysics as having some potential value, although not in the traditional sense.
So not as describing some ultimate reality.
No, he started thinking of it as a kind of secondary system, a way of organizing and explaining our experience, even if it doesn't describe some separate, independent reality.
Okay, so how did that work? What made him change his mind?
Well, it goes back to this idea of a primary system, which describes our direct observations, the basic facts we get from our senses. That's where the real content is, according to Ayer. But then we have these secondary systems, like metaphysics, that try to make sense of those basic facts.
So metaphysics is like the lens through which we view the world, even if it doesn't actually tell us about the world itself.
That's a good way to put it.
Interesting. So he was more open to the idea that metaphysics could be useful, even if not literally true.
Exactly. He even thought that changing our secondary system, like changing our metaphysical framework, could actually change how we see the world, what kinds of facts we can even think about.
Hmm. That's a powerful idea for a ruler, isn't it? To be able to shape how people understand the world, even if not directly controlling the world itself.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's talk about meaning, because obviously that's at the heart of Ayer's whole project.
Right. So at the center of his theory of meaning is this thing called the verification principle.
Verification. So being able to check if something's true, essentially.
Yeah, basically. In the first edition of Liquid Truth and Logic, he said that for a statement to be meaningful, it has to be either analytic-like, true by definition.
Okay, those are the tautologies we talked about before.
Right. Or it has to be empirically verifiable. Either strongly, meaning you can conclusively prove it, or weakly, meaning it at least contributes to confirming other observations.
So if you can't check if something's true, even in theory, it's meaningless.
That's the basic idea.
But I bet that principle ran into some problems.
You bet it did. It faced a lot of logical challenges. Alonzo Church, for example, argued that it might actually end up classifying almost any statement as meaningful, which wasn't the intention.
Oof, that's a big flaw. So did Ayer give up on the connection between meaning and evidence entirely?
Not completely. He still thought there was a strong link, even if the principle itself had problems. He was convinced that a good theory of confirmation, how we support our beliefs with evidence, was really important for a robust theory of meaning.
Okay, so the specifics of the verification principle were shaky, but the general idea still held up for him.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
It seems like pinning down exactly what meaning is a pretty tricky business.
It really is, and Ayer himself admitted that the principle was kind of vague in some ways. Like, was it just a rough guideline to distinguish sense from nonsense? Or was it a stronger claim saying that the way you verify something actually is its meaning?
So like two different levels of strictness.
Right. And he leaned towards that stronger interpretation when talking about things like statements about the past or the existence of other minds, which added a whole other layer of complexity.
Because you can't directly observe the past, for example.
Exactly. How do you verify a statement about something that's already happened? And when it came to other minds, he tried to develop a behaviorist account, defining mental states in terms of observable behaviors.
But at the same time, he wanted to hold on to a more traditional view of his own mind.
Right. It was tricky to make those two things fit together consistently.
So in the end, were the only things Ayer considered meaningful, without needing empirical verification, those tautologies, those statements that are true by definition?
Yeah, pretty much. He thought their meaning came solely from the rules of language itself, the conventions we've agreed on.
So a bachelor is an unmarried man is meaningful because of how we define those words, not because we need to go out and observe a bunch of bachelors in the wild.
Exactly.
Okay. So moving on, What about truth? What did Ayer have to say about that big philosophical question?
Well, following Russell and Ramsey, he made this key distinction between defining what truth is, what property all true statements share,
Right.
and figuring out how to determine which statements are actually true. Like, what's our method for verifying them?
Okay, so two separate issues. What was Ayer's take on the definition of truth?
In language, truth, and logic, he adopted this thing called a redundancy theory.
Redundancy. So, like, there's something extra there that we don't need.
Exactly. He famously said that in any sentence like P is true, that phrase is true is logically superfluous. It doesn't really add anything new.
So saying it's true that the sky is blue just means the sky is blue.
Pretty much. He didn't think there was some deep metaphysical essence of truth that we needed to uncover.
It's all about the statement itself, not some extra layer of truthiness on top of it.
That's it.
But didn't he later soften that view a bit?
Yeah, later on he admitted that in some specific cases you might actually need that truth predicate. So maybe not completely redundant in every situation.
Okay, interesting. So a bit more nuanced as time went on. What about the criterion of truth? How did Ayer think we figure out if something is actually true in practice?
He was a fan of the correspondence theory, as it was being debated in the Vienna Circle at the time. He said that for empirical statements, the way we figure out if they're true is by seeing if they match up with reality, with the facts as we observe them.
Makes sense. So our statements are like maps, and they're true if they accurately represent the territory of reality.
That's a good analogy. And this is actually a big part of why he rejected the idea that moral statements could be true or false.
Because he didn't think there were any objective moral facts out there, right?
Exactly. No moral facts for moral statements to correspond to. But there's another important nuance to Ayer's view on truth, even within this correspondence framework.
What was that?
Well, unlike some other thinkers who thought there were absolutely certain basic observations, Ayer actually agreed with Neurath that all our empirical statements are ultimately revisable.
Meaning we might always be wrong.
Well, that we should always be open to new evidence and potentially changing our minds. We aim for truth by making predictions about the future that we can then test.
So it's like science, always updating our understanding as we gather more information.
Exactly. Our knowledge of the world is always provisional.
Okay. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about perception. How did Ayer think we come to have experiences of this empirical reality in the first place?
In his early work, he was a big proponent of phenomenalism. He thought that any statement about physical objects could be translated into a statement about sense data.
So like instead of saying there's a table there, you'd say something like, I'm having these specific visual and tactile sensations.
Yeah, that's the idea. It's those sense data, those raw sensory experiences that are the real building blocks of our knowledge.
So a scepter, for example, is just a collection of sensations. Gold, heavy, smooth, etc.
Right. But later on, he moved away from that strict translatability requirement. He realized that you couldn't really capture everything about a physical object in terms of a finite set of sense data statements.
So it's more complex than just a one-to-one translation.
Yeah, but he still maintained that sense data were the ultimate justification for our beliefs about physical objects.
Okay, so how did that change his view of perception?
Well, it led to what he called sophisticated realism. It's still realism in the sense that he believed in physical objects, but it's sophisticated because he recognized that our perception of them is indirect.
We don't directly grasp the object itself. We have the sense data that mediate our experience.
Exactly. And he famously used the argument from illusion to support this.
Illusion like seeing a mirage in the desert.
Exactly. The fact that we can have these illusory experiences that feel just as real as genuine ones suggests that the immediate object of perception in both cases must be something mental, not the physical object itself.
So in both cases, we're only directly aware of our own sensory experience, not the external object.
That's right. And this means our everyday judgments about physical objects are actually going beyond what's strictly given in our immediate experience. They involve a kind of implicit theory about what's causing those sensations.
This is where J.L. Austin came in with his criticisms, right? In his book, Sense and Sensibilia.
Yeah, Austin really took issue with Ayer's whole argument from illusion. He questioned the distinction between veridical and non-veridical perception, even the very idea of sense data as the direct objects of perception.
So a pretty fundamental attack.
Yeah. And Strawson had his own criticisms, too. He argued that even when you're trying to describe what's directly given in experience, you're already using concepts that belong to this theoretical framework of physical objects.
So you can't really build that framework purely from sense data if you're already presupposing it in the first place.
That's the argument. So Ayer had to respond to these
How
challenges.
did he do that?
Well, he defended the distinction between veridical and non-veridical perception, and he said the argument from illusion was just one reason to accept the existence of sense data. There were others. And against Strawson, he admitted that our perceptual judgments do go beyond immediate experience, but he insisted they were still based on sense data, even if implicitly.
So a kind of compromise position.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, let's move on to another notoriously tricky area,
Yeah.
induction. How did Ayer deal with the problem of making general inferences from a limited set of observations?
He was very influenced by Hume on this. He defined induction negatively as any inference where the premises don't logically guarantee the conclusion.
So you can't be absolutely certain about the conclusion, even if the premises are true.
Right. And he agreed with Hume that all these inductive inferences rely on this assumption of the uniformity of nature, like the idea that the future will resemble the past, the unobserved will resemble the observed.
Which is a pretty big assumption.
It is. And like Hume, Ayer thought you couldn't really justify that assumption without getting into circular reasoning. You can't prove that nature is uniform by assuming it is uniform.
So he basically accepted that there's no rock-solid logical foundation for induction.
Yeah, pretty much. He thought the best we could do is to describe how we actually make these inductive inferences in practice while acknowledging that there's this inherent logical gap.
A leap of faith, in a way.
You could put it that way.
He also wasn't a fan of trying to solve the problem of induction using probability, right?
That's right. He criticized the idea that logical probability could be a reliable guide for making predictions. He had this great example of betting on a horse race.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, he said that you can have different sets of evidence leading to different probability estimates for which horse will win. And each of those estimates can be logically true, but then how do you choose which one is better? There's no principled way to do it.
So even if the probabilities are logically sound, they don't actually help us make a decision.
Exactly. And he had similar problems with the frequency interpretation of probability, where you define probability in terms of how often something happens in the long run. He pointed out that the probability of an event can change depending on how you define the reference class, the group of things you're comparing it to. And again, there's no clear rule for choosing the right reference class.
So both logical probability and frequency interpretations were out for him.
Yeah, he didn't think either of them really solved the problem of induction.
Okay, so if we can't be absolutely certain about our empirical knowledge and induction is so tricky, what did Ayer have to say about knowledge itself?
Well, in Language, Truth, and Logic, he actually rejected the idea that any empirical statement could be absolutely certain, even the ones that seem to be just reporting our immediate sensory experiences.
So even I see a red apple isn't completely certain.
He'd say it still involves concepts and interpretation, so it's always possible we're misinterpreting something. He even anticipated this idea of Quine, that we can always adjust our web of beliefs to fit with experience, so experience alone can't force us to give up any particular belief.
So always open to revision, even our most basic observations.
That's right. Later, in the problem of knowledge, he came up with a more context-dependent account of knowledge.
Meaning what?
Well, he still defined knowledge as justified true belief, but he added this requirement that you have to have the right to be sure, given the context.
Okay, so how does that work in practice?
Well, think about the difference between proving a mathematical theorem and knowing that you saw a red apple a minute ago. The standards of certainty are just different in those two cases.
Right, we don't expect the same level of rigor in everyday life as we do in mathematics.
Exactly. And Ayer thought the correct standard for knowledge was ultimately pragmatic. It's about what works, what's useful for us, not about trying to meet these impossible standards of absolute certainty that skeptics demand.
So a kind of common sense approach to knowledge.
Yeah, in a way.
But then there's this famous Getty problem, which seemed to throw a wrench into the whole justified true belief definition of knowledge.
Right. Gettier came up with these clever examples where someone has a belief that's both true and justified, but it doesn't seem like they really know it.
So a lucky guess, essentially.
It's more subtle than that. Typically, it involves having a justified belief in something false, which then, through a weird coincidence, leads to a true belief.
Okay, so you're right, it's more than just luck. So how did Ayer respond to that?
He thought these examples showed we needed to be more careful about what we mean by justified. He questioned whether justification is always preserved when you infer something from a false belief, even if that false belief was justified.
So the chain of reasoning can break down, even if the starting point seems solid.
Yeah, that's the idea.
All right. Let's move on to some more fundamental metaphysical concepts. How did Ayer understand necessity, causality, and free will?
In Language, Truth, and Logic, he famously said, all necessity is de dicto.
The dicto. Meaning what exactly?
It means that necessary truths, the things that absolutely have to be true,
Right.
are only true because of how we define the words we use. Like, all bachelors are unmarried is necessarily true, but only because that's how we define bachelor.
So the necessity comes from our language,
Yeah.
not from some deeper truth about bachelors themselves.
Exactly. And he contrasted this with necessity, the idea that things have essential properties they couldn't possibly lack. He wasn't a fan of that.
So no essentialism for Ayer.
No, he even had arguments against it, although they weren't always spot on. Like, he'd say you could name your dog Caesar, and then it would be true that Caesar is a dog, not a human. But that's kind of missing the point, right?
Yeah, because in that case, you're just changing the meaning of the name Caesar.
Mm.
It doesn't really tell us anything about the nature of humans or dogs.
Right. I think a more relevant part of his argument was his skepticism about using conceivability as a test for possibility. He said, what we can conceive of depends on what we know and how good our imaginations are.
So just because we can imagine something doesn't mean it's actually possible.
Exactly. And he also didn't buy into these theories that tried to ground the meaning of words in their causal origins.
Like the meaning of water is determined by the actual substance H2O that caused us to form that concept.
Yeah, that kind of thing. He thought necessity came from the identity of sense, like in the statement, Hesperus is Hesperus. That's necessarily true because Hesperus means the same thing on both sides of the equation.
So it's a tautology, true by definition.
Right.
What about causality? How did Ayer understand the relationship between cause and effect?
He was very much in the Humean tradition here. He basically reduced causality to regularity. So, to say that C causes E just means that events of type C are always followed by events of type E. We see this pattern, and we come to rely on it. That's what we call a law of nature.
So no deep metaphysical connection between cause and effect, just a pattern we observe.
That's right. And he insisted that these laws of nature are ultimately contingent, not necessary.
Meaning they could have been different.
Yeah, they're just generalizations based on our experience. And this view of causality actually shaped his stance on free will.
How so?
Well, because he didn't believe in the strong metaphysical kind of necessity in the world, he thought free will and determinism were compatible.
Meaning you could believe that all our actions are caused, but still think we have free will.
That's it. He thought the opposite of freedom wasn't being caused, but being constrained or forced to do something against your will.
Like the classic example of the robber with a gun.
Exactly. You're still caused to hand over your money, but you're not doing it freely. But he did recognize that this raises a problem for compatibilism. Well, if no causes are truly necessary, then why do some causes seem to take away our freedom while others don't? It's hard to draw a clear line between those different kinds of causes.
That's a good point. Okay, let's finish up with Ayer's view on ethics. His emotivism is probably one of his most discussed and often criticized ideas.
Definitely. It all stems from his strong commitment to the fact-value distinction.
The idea that you can't derive an ought from an is.
Exactly. He argued that because there are no objective moral facts, ethical statements can't really be true or false. They don't give us information about the world.
So what are they doing then?
He thought they were primarily expressing our emotions or feelings. So to say stealing is wrong isn't to state a fact about stealing, it's to express your disapproval of stealing.
Like, boo, steal.
Basically. Although later he added this prescriptive element, suggesting that moral statements are also trying to evoke similar feelings in others and get them to act accordingly.
So it's not just about venting your own emotions, it's about trying to influence others.
Right. But still, the core idea is that these statements aren't about describing moral facts. They're about expressing attitudes.
But surely people disagree about morality all the time. Doesn't that suggest there are some real moral facts they're disagreeing about?
That's a common objection. And Ayer, along with C.L. Stevenson, who had similar ideas, tried to address this by saying that what look like moral disagreements are often just disagreements about non-moral facts. Like, maybe we agree that causing unnecessary suffering is bad, but we disagree about whether a particular action will actually cause suffering.
So the disagreement is about the facts of the situation, not about some underlying moral principle.
Right. Or, they argued, sometimes it's not a real disagreement at all, just a clash of emotions. Like we both have different gut reactions to something, and there's no objective way to settle who's right.
But there's also this problem of how moral terms work in logical arguments, right? The Frege problem.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It points out that when you put moral terms into conditionals, like if stealing is wrong, then Robin Hood was wrong, they seem to lose their emotive force. And that can lead to problems if you're trying to use them in a logical argument.
Because it seems like the meaning of wrong has to shift in those contexts for the argument to work.
Exactly.
And on top of all that, there are those who connected Ayer's emotivism with the rise of fascism after World War II.
Yeah, that was a pretty serious charge. Thinkers like Giles Romilly and C.E.M. Joad argued that logical positivism, by rejecting objective morality, had created this moral vacuum that allowed these dangerous ideologies to flourish.
So the idea is that if there's no right and wrong, then anything goes.
That's the worry. And Joad specifically criticized Ayer for rejecting metaphysics, saying that made it impossible to offer a philosophical critique of fascism.
How did Ayer respond to that?
Well, he said it was actually the fascists who were making the logical error by trying to derive moral values from supposed facts about race or history. And he pointed out that logical positivism, by being skeptical of these grand metaphysical systems, was actually opposed to the kinds of things fascists often relied on.
So in a way, he was saying logical positivism was a kind of antidote to fascism.
Yeah, I think that was his argument. Although later on, he did reflect on the limitations of his purely philosophical approach to these big political questions.
Well, that's understandable. Philosophy can only take us so far.
Yeah.
Okay, Your Majesty, we've covered a lot of ground here. What would you say are the key takeaways from Ayer's thought, the things that are most relevant for a philosopher king?
I think three things stand out. First, this focus on empirical evidence as the basis for meaningful claims. The verification principle, even with its flaws, really highlights that. Second, his deflationary view of truth. It forces us to think hard about what we're even doing when we say something is true. And third, his emotivism, even if you don't agree with it, makes you think carefully about the nature of moral judgment.
So how might these ideas inform the decisions of a ruler?
Well, I think that emphasis on evidence could lead to a more cautious and less dogmatic approach to policy. You'd be less likely to make decisions based on, like, untested ideologies or grand pronouncements. And that deflationary view of truth could encourage a more pragmatic approach to evaluating different claims and perspectives. You wouldn't get bogged down in these absolute notions of truth and falsehood. And even if you ultimately reject emotivism, it still raises important questions about the role of emotions and attitudes in moral decision-making.
Excellent points. So by understanding the limits of knowledge, the nature of truth, and the complexities of moral judgment, a ruler can make more informed and effective decisions.
That's the idea.
And for our final thought-provoking question, given Ayer's view that metaphysical claims, while potentially meaningless in a strict sense, can still shape our understanding of the world, how much do you think the conceptual frameworks we adopt, even if they're not literally true, actually determine the kind of reality we experience and the values we live by? Something to ponder as you continue your wise rule. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.